This is Politricking
On record, Tshidi.
with Tshidi Madia on EWN.
Hello, welcome to Politricking with myself, Tshidi Madia. We're on season 6, episode 14 of a politics podcast brought to you by Eyewitness News. So I have been trying to get this guest. I don't know how I got a green light, but anyway, I do. I wanted to bring this guest to people's attention because I don't think people recognize or see him. He kind of moves between the shadows, but he's there. He's in government, he's there. He holds a very important job in his political party as well. I'm joined in studio by Ashor Sarupen. Ask yourself, who's Ashor? I can tell you when I first met Ashor. How are you, Ashor?
I'm
Welcome.
very good. How are you, Judy?
The first time I met you was 2019.
Correct.
When Helen had launched her comeback into the leadership of the DA. And Helen Zille said to me, you passed by, and she said to me, if you want to know who did it, that guy did it, pointing to Ashor Sarupen. So ever since then, I've kind of been like, oh, there's a bit of a cult figure, so I've kind of paid attention to him. Of course, when the GNU was announced, he was appointed as one of the deputy finance ministers. So we'll have a conversation about finance. We'll speak about the Democratic Alliance, and hopefully bits and pieces of things in between. Like I said, it's good to see you. It's my first time having a conversation with you. I'm a little bit happy, but I want to start with, I think one of the big talking points was about BEE. Last week, we saw information being put forward by Solidarity, the Free Market Foundation, their research about the impact of BEE and its hindrance as far as economic growth is important. Economic growth is something that the DA speaks about quite often. Do you share their sentiments when you looked at that research? I don't know if you had a chance, if you share their perspective.
So what I agree with very strongly is that BEE has become a very major brake on the economy, and that it is one of the hindrances to getting the kind of growth that we need. And I also principally and personally, so I'll give you my personal view here, and that is that after 30 years of attempts at redress, what we have produced is a middle class that includes black, colored, and Indian people, and an upper class that includes black, colored, and Indian people. And so if we continue to use race and only race as the basis on which we construct our systems, what you end up with is empowering the same people over and over because they have access to information. They're the ones who have the time and the resources to go and fill in the paperwork and so on. And what we have now got to do is shift our redress systems to targeting poor people, most of whom are black in South Africa. But we've got to be better targeting. And a couple of years ago in the DN and in the public domain, there was a debate as to whether race is a proxy for disadvantage. Well, the reality is when it comes to privilege, the privilege no longer has a race. You've got privileged people in South Africa of all sorts of races. And so what we have got to do is now say we are looking at poverty, not race. And most poor people in South Africa are black. There's no two ways about that. And how do we make sure that we pull millions and millions of poor people into the mainstream of the economy? Is giving shares in businesses, deterring investment and so on the way to do it? I would argue probably not, and that there are far better targeted ways to help poor people get into the mainstream of the economy.
What would those be, though? Give me 3 easy ways where you get poorer people absorbed into the system.
Well, firstly, we've got to start with the education system. And the education system as a whole produces people who, when they finish matric, are not able to enter the job market. So what we have in South Africa is this interesting thing where we pay very high degree premium to get people into entry-level jobs. There are secretaries with 2 degrees in South Africa who earn above middle-class salaries, but we place such a premium on the degree, and we pay them accordingly, and we lock people fresh out of matric out of those jobs. We don't stream people appropriately and so on. So we've got to rethink how we handle and manage the education system to get people through. The second thing is the kind of investments we make into people who are already out of the system, long-term unemployed people. There are millions of people in South Africa who are in households where their grandparents never had a job, they never had a job, their parents never had a job. And so you perpetuate the cycle of long-term unemployment. Because employment requires a set of skills. You're going to work on time, understanding that you've got to report to a boss, those sorts of things. And we take it for granted that these are things that people are inherently born with. Everything that we get to do in life, we learn from someone. And when you have long-term unemployed households and intergenerational unemployment, that becomes a problem. So expanding internships and apprenticeships and so on is going to be a critical second part of that. I think the third part is when you look at the amount of resources we spend on trying to get people into university through NSFAS and free for education. And obviously there's a lot of social pressure around that, rightly or wrongly. It exists and the state has responded to it. But we spend 70 million rand getting people into university, 70 billion a year. When you look at what we actually try to do to get people who don't get into the university system, and in getting into that university system will always be a privileged few. When you look at the kind of things that we do, it's massively fragmented. Some provinces are doing something. The national government has got all these active labor market programs and so on. And it's fragmented. It doesn't produce results because we keep perpetuating unemployment. And so fixing that and saying, how do we create the kind of labor activation programs that pull people from long-term unemployment into employability, and then employment is got to be the way to do it.
At some point, though, there was this massive talk about TVET colleges being an alternative and being that actually if we drive people in this direction, it will ultimately lead to employment opportunities, growth. People can actually become masters of their own destinies, if you skill them that way. That doesn't seem to take off. When I look at our TVET colleges, we're not getting to where we need to. What's the hindrance?
So I was looking at some of the DART and TVET colleges, interestingly, and I looked at the government's throughput rate report on TVET colleges. And the challenge is, one of the challenges is, when I looked at the 2019 to 2022 data, 3 years, people who start TVET in 2019, only 10% finished TVET in 2022. So your first problem is this, that we are taking people who probably should be into TVET and taking them into university, and we've got this massive first-year dropout rate. And then we're taking people who should probably be into the labor markets, and we're putting them into TVET colleges. And so the entire system is stacked against you from the day you finish because of the way we have almost placed a premium on sort of results and so on over actual skills. And so we looked at, and as a society, and I think we must confront that, we look down on people with TVET colleges and matriculation. We need to stop doing that because technical skills go a long way.
It's true. Society does do that. I want to go back to the solidarity report. You said you agree with them somewhat, and I think you've explained it. Where do you disagree with them?
Well, look, I think that when I look at the numbers and so on, I still want to interrogate that report in more detail. So
yeah, I'm not convinced by it either.
So I need to, I work with thankfully at the Treasury, a wonderful economic policy team headed by a very capable Deputy Director General Boybusa Modise, who is an absolutely exceptional person in economic policy. And I'll sit down with the Treasury team and try to unpack the numbers because I never take any numbers at face value because
I don't expect you to.
and so I want to interrogate the numbers in more detail. So obviously the report's only been out for less than a week now.
Yeah, it's not long.
And I do want to chat with some of my colleagues who are professional economists. I'm not an economist, of course, and I don't pretend to be one. I'm a politician. So I will and then I will make up my own mind about the validity of the details of the report. But in principle, some of the ideas that they speak about on how it costs the economy growth and investment. It's not just solidarity. In 2007 or 2008, the government put out its own report that said that it's a break on economic growth.
I was going to ask you when you compare that versus the issue of structural, the issue of structural problems, because every other day what we speak about is the structural hindrances to South Africa's mission of economic growth. I almost feel, even when I listen to the DA, I don't think there's any party that's got me feeling convinced that when you speak of economic growth, you're speaking of a unicorn. When you look at our rates and you go, yeah, here we go. Here they go, dreaming again of the impossible. But we haven't dealt with these structural issues and made the necessary adjustments. We talk about it. Even you, who is in government, are part of the conversation. We are not seeing implementation and movement yet, at least movement that feels satisfactory to us as the public.
Yeah. So, I mean, during the fight over the budget, there was all the DA's documents, some of which were praised and criticized for. But what you saw in those documents was a push to try to accelerate structural reform. The truth is that those are the biggest breaks in economic growth right now. Before you get to BE and so on, the market structure of our key network industries is fatally flawed because it's state-run monopolies and they pass their corruption and inefficiency onto South African society. So let's start with energy, because energy is the single biggest break in the economy. When we had the worst year of load shedding on record 2 years ago, we got 6% economic growth. And I think last year we got 0.7, although stats say now is revising it down to 0.5. But we had a year of very high load shedding and we got very weak growth. We had a year of very low load shedding and we got very weak growth. So what has happened in the real economy is that two things. Because we had such high load shedding, lots of businesses, firms, households used all of their spare capital and their borrowing capacity to make themselves load shedding proof, install solar and generators and backups and so on. And now when load shedding's gone, it's a sunk cost because they can no longer, the money, they're still paying for these things, even though electricity is stable. But the money that they would have spent to either hire more staff or expand their business is now gone into making themselves load shedding proof. And so it's a drag. But the other half of the equation, we keep thinking about stability of supply, is half of the electricity problem. And that's part of the market structure problem. The other half is the pricing problem. So if you cast your mind back, when I had just finished high school and started university, 2007, when load shedding started. Yeah, I think you were probably in university as well at that stage.
Just towards I'm a little bit older than you. I think I'm like just like a fraction
we're
above
tail
you,
end
but
of
like
university,
somewhere
I think.
there. Yeah.
You know, we're contemporaneous in that sense. But if you cast your mind back to when it started, in that first year after load shedding started, Eskom announced their price hikes of 33% a year for the 3 years. And we've had this above inflation price increases in energy. When you look at the raw data, electricity prices have gone up over 400% since 2007. Prices in the real economy have gone up around 200%, plus or minus a few percentage points. But that's on average. So this is driving inflation. It's crowding out the ability because firms and households are spending more and more of their money on electricity, which may or may not be there. And there's not enough money left for everything else. So hence the cost of living crisis, people being squeezed and so on. So really dealing with the market structure and energy is important. And you're right. And if we can sort out energy supply stability and market structure and pricing stability, and if it can just continue to rise with inflation, we would suddenly, the investment from all of that, as well as the price stability, the freeing up people's money in their pockets and so on, would probably bring in 1% GDP growth. It's one of the single biggest things that we can do is sort out energy. So seeing that Electricity Regulation Act, which creates the basis for a competitive market, is quite important. But let me also say this, and it does get people's backs up when I say the following, but I'm going to say it and it'll be now on air. We cannot have a competitive energy market if you have an Eskom with an 86% market share, because you're still at the subject of the one player, the monopoly player. There's no competition at 86%. And so to get to
That's a contentious point.
It is a contentious point.
Altogether, yeah.
And people disagree with me, and that's fine. We can have different opinions, and we should. But my view is that you've got to do what the Latin Americans did in the late 80s and early 90s, and the Europeans and others, and break up your energy monopoly into multiple firms. So not just where they speak about the vertical unbundling, which is transmission, generation, and distribution.
Yes.
But we've got to also start speaking about horizontal unbundling, which is breaking up Eskom's generating capacity into different companies and then getting private capital into them, either selling them, concessioning them, there's little different models.
Yeah, I see
and get
that.
the money in because the money's got to go into fixed electricity plants. But bringing these things on stream, also part of the transition to more green energy and so on, but getting these things on stream and having them compete is absolutely critical. So let me give you an example of how energy...
I also don't see how that goes down well. I think about the unions. I think about everything that's attached with your partner in the GNU. And I just know that that's not going to fly.
It has to if we're going to get growth moving. Is we have to have a competitive energy market. And so it's going to be, and it will be a point of contention in the GNU, and it will be something that will have arguments and so on, but it's got to be done. And the end state of the Electricity Regulation Act, we passed an act that actually envisages this kind of competitive market. It creates the regulatory and legal framework. So we've got to end up there. And it's either that or we condemn ourselves to 40% increases per year in perpetuity, and then our cost of living crisis persists, or we condemn ourselves to load shedding. But that is the reality. Yeah,
that's a tough one.
It is a tough one, but it's a fight that needs to be had.
It sounds to me that we must actually prepare ourselves for that next round in the GNU, the battle over what must happen with some of our SOEs, particularly Eskom, clearly.
Yes.
Right? I'll probably come back to this because we'll talk about the GNU, but I want to continue a little bit on the budget.
Yes.
What was interesting for me with budget, I mean, never mind that it was a mess. Never mind it was a mess. All of you. It was also having the credibility of Treasury questioned, the markets questioning it, but even politically, there were questions about it. So politically, the question is, oh no, they don't take political considerations at all. They don't think about those at all when making decisions. Everybody must be included. Markets-wise, politics is tinkering with the economy.
So in the South African economy, there's an interesting thing that Professor Nick Binedell, who was a professor of mine at Gibbs across some of my degrees.
I know Nick Binedell,
Yes, and he always said that in most countries, economics drives politics. In South Africa, we've got the inverse, and that's politics drives economics. And that's been true for the longest time. And it drives low growth, or it can drive high growth, and so on. So the fundamentals of our economy are dependent on our politics. And what happened with the budget was a couple of things. I think the first thing is that the budget process was set into motion with the reforms of the early and mid-90s, when the ANC took office and basically created a system where a very capable and strong finance minister is able to get things through cabinets, and that it was designed for a single-party system, and to ensure that the finance minister, provided he has the backing of the presidency and others, is able to get things through a cabinet that may be contentious. And that worked for a particular state in time when you had a dominant party. At one stage, the ANC had 69.69% of the votes, and we were very lucky to have one Trevor Manuel as the finance minister at that stage.
Yes, I remember that period. Yeah.
It was designed around that. But so much of South Africa is written around the personalities of the 90s and early 2000s. We wrote a constitution for Nelson Mandela, not for Jacob Zuma, for example. So much of these systems are designed around those very capable individuals and those very ethically sound individuals and so on, and in terms of the Constitution. So the budget process followed its normal trajectory and carried on without any kind of systemic reform in dealing with, of course, multi-party politics. And I think that some hard lessons have been learned by the Treasury and all of us there, firstly, on the process. And I think what you'll see starting with the MTBPS this year is a better process. But the reality is when it comes to civil servants, they will do what they always do because it's written down in documents. They're measured against certain targets. And it's not a failing of the finance minister, or it's a failing of the entire system that we couldn't pivot. I don't think Treasury's credibility in the long run has been damaged because they were able to draft 3 budgets in 3 months. If you go and find a group of technical people who can do that anywhere, I mean, it's remarkable. Firstly. Secondly, I think that we give ourselves too much. We like to beat ourselves up as South Africans and as a society. The French had to fire 2 prime ministers to pass a budget. The Spanish government, I think, is continuing resolutions for 2 years. The German government is continuing.
Also to vote, yeah.
Yes, exactly. They're continuing. Coalition politics makes budgeting quite difficult because you're dealing with competing interests and competing political ideologies and so on. So there is that. So I don't think that the Treasury as an institution is that weakened. In fact, I think that because it's one of the few places in government that can learn continuously, I think that the officials have learned quite a lot. And I think that on the process side, it would be better going forward. And I look forward to the MTBPS process because I think it'll show that we have learned lessons at the Treasury. So that's that. The other thing is, of course, that at the end of the day, there's a lot of financial pressure on the state system because everybody creates an NGO when they want something, puts pressure through society on the government, and says government is failing. And yes, government is failing at lots of things.
Yeah.
But this is also in the context of compounded 15 years of low growth, 1.194% GDP growth on average for 15 years. And in that context, there's not going to be enough fiscal space to do all the things that we want to do. And so what we have got to do as a country, and then through the politicians, through people like myself, is decide what our priorities are. And the problem with government, of course, is that you've got ministers. Ministers are in departments. Departments want priorities. Ministers have ideas. They want to execute them. But certain things at a given point in a country's history are less important than others. I'm not going to name it because I'm in government with a lot of people and I don't want to burn bridges here. But
I've got a question for you that might help you burn a few bridges, but yeah.
Okay, I don't want to burn bridges with my colleagues. I mean, I've got to, but the thing is, we have got to decide what is absolutely critical to fund right now to solve some of the biggest social and economic issues. And then we've got to say, these things we can do without. And it might be painful to go without some of these things for a short period of time, but we've got to do it. And that's why the spending reviews is so important, because if we can identify programs that are either not performing, not producing results, whenever politicians come in, of course, into office and they want to do things, they want to create a new program. They want to cut a ribbon.
They want to cut ribbons.
They want to kiss babies. Politicians love making announcements.
They love, yeah.
You see,
they do.
I don't like making, as you know, I don't like making announcements. It's not my thing. I prefer systems, processes, and then get results at the end. But people like to make announcements, and the public like hearing that politicians are busy making announcements. The process things and the stuff I do that cares about what is the results in 5, 10, 15 years, it's not going to win any votes. And I'm acutely aware of that. But it's important to have those people in the system, people like me as well. But we have got to decide. And so in the process of government, new people come in, they create new programs. Sometimes those programs are doing the same things that old programs are doing, but they don't like the people working in those old programs. And so they create a new things.
But actually, isn't that why we have a super presidency, a parallel government running from the president's office?
I again, I don't want to burn my bridges with the president. I have the highest respect for the presidency.
I've got respect for him too, but I recognize what's happened.
No, look, yes.
It's a failure to trust your government, your DGs, that you've created a super presidency. That is actually very telling. The fact that local government is not going to be left to Operation Vulindlela, which sits where? Where does it sit?
That's in the presidency, you're correct.
Exactly. So what is that saying?
Look, I think what it shows is actually it accelerates the argument that myself and others have been making for a full-scale spending review, because when I've mapped this out together with some of the technical people in government, across national and provincial government, we've got 4,500 sub-programs, which are duplicating each other, tripping over each other. So we've got to...
And the cost. I don't want to start talking about
yes,
a bloated
exactly.
government, but the cost of that.
Of that, yes.
Duplication.
Yes.
I mean...
So I've been studying this stuff very carefully, and really I think that we have got to... And as you said earlier with Eskom and others, the challenge is going to be unions are going to shout, people with vested interests are going to... But we've got to actually do this, and we've got to... not just write a spending review report that says there are 4,500 programs, sub-programs, and these are all the duplications, and these are all the things that sound nice, have hardworking people, don't produce results for society. We've got to take the decision, say, we're closing these things. And if some of these things might be better served in the presidency, fine, but then the unit that exists in a department that's doing the same thing shouldn't exist.
Exactly. I know you've been saying you don't want to burn bridges, but if it was... before May 2024. And whatever happened with the budget happened and the DA was on the opposition benches. You would have long called for Enoch Gondongwana's head. You and I know that there would have been posters, there would have been campaigns calling for the finance minister to go. The difficulty is you now serve alongside him, right? In finance, he's your colleague in government. Just assessing that, his performance, and where you would have been on that performance had you not been in government. So,
yes, let me say this, because I've been on the inside, that there was and remains huge pressure, particularly in frontline services, health and education. And what the finance minister was trying to do was resolve that. Was it the right route? And yes, before, the thing about opposition politics, it's also incredibly easy to just throw spears in the direction of your opponents and attack them viciously.
But you should be able to also have a critical analysis of your colleague's performance.
Yes, I do, and I do, and my critical analysis stays between myself and the minister in his office. Because at the end of the day, when you're in government, you've got to also say, what is the good... In the end, we didn't get any VAT hikes. In the end. So and it was a fight, and it was a big bun fight, and the minister
it
attacked
was
the
the
DA,
brink,
and the
yeah.
DA attacked the and yes, it went to the brink. So we did do those. The DA did do those sorts of things, and fought very hard. But when it came down to it, remember last Friday there was a motion of censure against the Minister of Finance, and only the MK, not even only the MK party voted for their own motion of censure. Everyone else opposed it. So it's not just the DA; it's the entire political spectrum looked at the situation and said, the minister put a proposal. It didn't have the buy-in of society. It was rejected. He put a second proposal. It was rejected. A third proposal came out. It was accepted. He's someone capable of learning, firstly. But secondly, again, the minister and I have a very frank relationship. And when he disagrees with me, he tells me straight up. And when I disagree with him, I tell him straight up in the privacy of our offices. And we will have our differences there very strongly, very robustly, and so on.
That's good to know.
But we also, what we have both agreed, the minister and I, is that we won't ever attack each other in public, and I will not attack Minister Godongwana in public. And what we've also agreed is that we will find each other on the things where we fundamentally disagree in the medium term through discussion and debate, because at the end of the day, I will say this for Minister Godongwana, is that when he goes to the Treasury, he doesn't put on an ANC hat and say, I'm here to deliver an ANC agenda. He says, I'm here to deliver what I can do for the people of South Africa. And do people make mistakes? Yes. Are those mistakes? Is Minister Godongwana stealing from the Treasury? No, he's clean. Is he trying to enrich himself through? No, he's not. He's clean. So when you look at politicians who are doing those sorts of things versus someone who makes a policy decision that Parliament rejects, Parliament has the right to reject. That's why the budget process goes through Parliament. Should we be taking the guy out and saying that he must no longer be there because he made a policy decision that the country disagreed with? No, the politicians make policy decisions. The policy decisions can be rejected, and we move on.
Does the DA then concede? Because here's the other interesting thing about the budget for me. Fuel levy was a massive issue in the years. Over the past years for the DA, a zero-rated goods basket. Mm-hmm. They're gone.
For this year, yes.
Yeah, do you then sit there and go, oh, the things that we wanted had to be sacrificed. This is the painful bits of moving the needle. Is that it?
It is painful. It is painful, but at the end of the day, so there are a couple of things. I think firstly on the fuel levy that the government still managed to cut the fuel price this month in spite of the fuel levy.
Yes, it did.
And
it's
fuel,
minimal. As a driver, as a motorist, it was minimal.
I know the pain. Don't worry. But we were able to cut the fuel price, and fuel prices are about R2 a litre lower than they were at the peak of the cost of living crisis 2 years ago. And with subdued, when you look at the outlook on oil prices, so you take these decisions on balance, and you say, okay, is the fuel price going to trend upwards over the next 2 years, or is it going to trend downwards? And the trend is downwards, because of the state of the global economy and what's going on with demand in the oil markets and so on. I mean, this week's geopolitics notwithstanding, which
we're going to speak about those too. Yeah.
I try not to comment on foreign affairs, but so when you look at that, you say, okay, will this cause fuel prices to massively spike, or will it keep going down? It'll keep going down. So that's the first thing on the fuel price. So at least the direction of travel there means that it'll ease cost of living. The second thing is the under zero-rated VAT basket. Yes, it is something we would want to have expanded and so on. But the thing about coalition governments is that you can't get everything you want all of the time. And so the way I see it is that the voters didn't give anybody a mandate. They gave the ANC approximately 40%. They gave the DA 22%. For every two things the ANC gets, the DA must get one thing. That's what the voters wanted. And that's what they gave us, and that's how it must work in government. So we want, when you look at the bigger macroeconomic issues, containing government debt, reducing borrowing, growing the primary fiscal surplus so that we stabilize debt and we peak debt to GDP this year, those are far bigger fights to have so that in 5 years' time and in 10 years' time, South Africa is in a better place. And then as the fiscal space opens up, you can get the zero-rated VAT basket. But it's about knowing how to get there and not creating shocks in the economy. So, we could fight very hard for a zero-rated VAT basket, then we could borrow an extra 3 billion rand a year and then pay interest and all of that. And a country that's borrows 400 billion rand a year. Not a good idea right now. So everything is resource dependent. And in my mind, freeing up the resources, and you know what? If we get the spending reviews right and again, and we close things, and we can find 2 billion rand, we can then do some zero rating. But you've got to first find the money from within the baseline. And I think what this VAT fight has done is very important. Is South African society, forget the DA and the politics, South African society has now told government, we've given you enough money. We take enough out of our pockets for you, and you in government, and I'm in government, of course, so this is a message to me. You in government, sort yourself out, find the money from either dealing with corruption, your wastage, and whatever, to do the things we want you to do. And that is now our job. And that's, again, why I'm so firm in spending reviews.
Makes sense. I know you don't want to speak about international geopolitics, but we've got to. I mean, so you're watching Iran and Israel's current conflict. You have analysts saying that no matter what happens, South Africa's partnership in BRICS it puts us in the crosshairs of whatever's happening, because to them, it's not about Iran, it's not about Israel, it's about the USA and the fall of their hegemony. Just your observation on what that is. I'll bring us further into the conversation, but just your observation on what that is.
Yeah, so firstly, I think we must not think of BRICS as a properly consolidated, unified bloc of countries. And that's the mistake everyone makes. India is not fundamentally. India has its cake and eats it too.
Yes, it does.
They buy Russian oil and they do American. Yes,
with Trump. Yes,
yes,
it does.
because Trump is his dear friend and so on. So
that's what South Africa, I think, wants to be.
Yes,
mind
but
you.
yes, but
Non-alliance.
you've got to finesse it better than we do. That's the thing. We don't finesse things very well. But when you look at so there's that. Brazil fundamentally, the Lula's in government and so on. But his politics, and while his politics is left, Brazil's orientation is fundamentally towards the West. There's that as well. So there's that. You've got Brazil and India on one side. You've got Russia and China on the other side. You've got South Africa. South Africa is like the apostrophe S in BRICS. We're not anywhere near the size of those economies.
No, we're not.
We're not near. And so, and we also, South Africans, we like thinking we're exceptional and so on. We're the apostrophe S in BRICS. We're not near the growth rates of those economies. Russia gets 3.4% growth in the middle of a war. We're not near that kind of productivity, and so on. And so we actually need to start thinking that we need to aspire to be, at least in terms of productivity and growth and so on, more like the other BRIC countries. So there's that. So firstly, we mustn't overstate what we
our importance
and the globals. So I go to some of these meetings. I go to a BRICS finance ministers meeting, or this last week I was at a SADC finance ministers meeting on behalf of the minister and so on. And obviously in SADC we're quite big, but in the global pond we're quite small. There's the G20 meeting in Washington recently and so on. And we do punch above our weight despite our size, but we're what we are at our core is a middle income open economy subject to all of the trade winds of the world. When I was doing my master's in corporate strategy, I wrote my dissertation on the impact of deglobalization on the South African economy. And it struck me when I was doing all my research for that dissertation as to how ordinary we are in the world. As much
it's
as
quite painful for South Africans.
It's painful.
Don't want to hear it.
And
we don't want to be told.
As a very proud South
ordinary.
African, going through that process was quite something, and understanding how deglobalization, the first wave of Trump tariffs and so on, and the retaliatory, we're not makers of global policy, we're takers on the receiving end.
Yeah.
And what we have got to do is finesse our way through this. And that's
the clumsiness that you speak of when people think about Russia, Ukraine, even the Middle East. Mind you, at some point, what you did see, at least recently, is some countries moving closer to South Africa's position. But because of how clumsily they've been handled before, people aren't willing to concede that maybe South Africa had a point in some of these instances. I take that. What was your impressions of us in Washington?
Look, I think that Mr. Trump is now going to come to the G20 later this year. That's that. So that's
the win.
He's going to come and see. He's going to come and see for himself
that there is no bloody genocide in South Africa.
He needs to come and see for himself, and then he needs to.
But we and I are in agreement. I'm like, what? It's not crazy. There's no genocide.
Look, no. Look, but the reality for me, I think. Let me say this: One of the things is that is embarrassing is that our defense against that accusation was we were effectively saying to the world, crime in South Africa is so bad it affects everyone, which is correct and true. But how do we then market, say, come and visit South Africa, tourists?
It's humiliating,
when
yeah.
we had to go to the White House, and our only defense was, well, crime is really bad in South Africa. And everyone in the delegation basically said, yes, crime is so bad it affects whether you're on the Cape Flats or you're a farmer with farm murders, or you are in Alex or Soweto and so on, or in the suburbs. And so for me, and if I take my political hat off and policy hat off, and just think as a South African, it's a little bit embarrassing that that's our defense. And how do we then persuade tourists, and we've got, in my opinion, the most beautiful country in the world, to keep coming? How do we market ourselves to investors and so on? When everyone knows crime is foundational, and dealing with crime and having rule of law and order is foundational to economic growth. So you spoke about structure and so on, and structural unemployment and skills mismatch. We covered all of that. The one thing we don't speak enough about and then try to solve is the foundation. So if you are concerned that if you make fixed investment into a country, capital assets, factories, machines, and so on, if you're concerned that the metal is going to be stolen for scrap metal, are you likely to invest? No. If you're concerned that your employee is going to be robbed as they leave work, and when you pay them their wages, which happens routinely, are you going to invest? No. And so we've actually also, the investment case is weakened because of crime. And, we went to the White House and basically had to concede that the crime issue is quite severe, and it is quite severe. And so that foundation is important. And of course, during the state capture years, half of the issue is crime and safety. The other half is rule of law. And investors who can put their money anywhere in the world also look at rule of law. Do you apply your laws consistently? Do you apply them fairly? Do you prosecute white-collar crime? And when you look at the slow state of prosecution of the Zondo Commission and so on...
I was about to tell you, when you said State Capture Commission, we're not seeing people in orange
exactly.
overalls. We are not satisfied with the
So we've got the double problem. If you think of the economy as economic policy as a pyramid, the first layer of your pyramid is crime, safety, and rule of law. That's not in place. So we try to do all these other clever things. We have industrial master plans. The industrial master plans won't go far until you solve the base of the pyramid, which is crime and safety and rule of law.
I want to come back to GNU. Oh, my goodness. I want to come back to the GNU conversation. I was wondering what is the next frontier, but you've already made it clear that it's going to be ESCOM.
Well, it's not just ESCOM. I mean, obviously, there's Transnet and logistics as well. So, I mean, 1% of GDP per annum growth compounded is sitting in dealing with energy. Another probably 0.5 to 0.75 is logistics. And it was very interesting. I met with CEOs in fuel and a few other things. And it was pointed out to me that it is more expensive to use Transnet's fuel pipelines to transport fuel around the country than to use trucks. It is more expensive to use Transnet's automotive corridor freight line than it is to use trucks. Now this is a complete distortion.
And we are at a point where we should be trying to get fewer trucks on the road.
Exactly.
Getting them off the road.
Yes. And so I think yes, part of this, I hope that we are finding each other on this, and Barbara Creasy's done some very good work already on getting the RFIs out, and there's been good uptake on the RFIs to show that there is private sector appetite and RFPs, because we've got to make those things cost competitive. The ports cost the South African economy 357 billion rand a year. The World Bank rates our ports as some of the worst in the world. In the 7 trillion rand economy, 357 billion is 5% of GDP. Now, if you fix them overnight, you won't get 5% growth immediately. But what you will do is more people being able to export and import, move goods and services around the country, and that'll be easier. So really getting that baseline market structure on critical network industries fixed is I think the next frontier in the GNU. And once you fix that, that's the most critical thing. Then you move on to, I think, labor markets, certainly, and we need more flexibility. We have European Union levels of labor markets, rigidity, but we don't have a European Union economy yet. One day when we do, I would love this labor system, but we don't. And so we've got to compete globally.
I didn't ask about the DA's bid for employment equity to challenge the amendments to the employment equity, but I don't want to because I'm also worried about time. But I do note it, and I'm sure you'll defend your party's position vigorously. Let's speak about, because I was wanting to speak to you about GNU. you've managed to get over a hurdle where you were almost at the brink, where the NC caucus says that it deals with an aggressive, hostile DA caucus every day, that it's different for those who are in government who seem to get along very well. They have a very different view. I had the chief whip of the NC here, and I think he had a meeting with George Mikalakis as well to try and find a way forward. But part of that was happening because the NC caucus was saying NC must have an NEC and get out of this partnership. And I think the secretariat that must convene in NEC held off for long enough to get over the line, to get through budgets and the likes. They'll be meeting sometime this month. There are no concerns that that particular meeting will try and push the DA out. You've marked a year now of GNU. Do you feel more comfortable in the coalition?
We can't control what happens inside the ANC. None of us ANC members. And so whatever they decide, they decide. I will say this, that the GNU isn't an arrangement because these are the optimal coalition setups that the parties wanted. This is what the voters have given us. And in politics, the choice is always as opposed to what. So I'm hoping that the ANC understands that the choice is also as opposed to what. And do you want the architects of state capture who are now sitting on the benches of parliament back into government through MK? I would argue that that's a very, very bad idea. And that the road to electoral ruin for the ANC sits in that side of the world, and actually the road to survival sits in the GNU range. That would be my argument to the ANC. But in terms of the function of government and so on, this is South Africa's first real coalition government. The GNU of 94-96 was an ANC government with invited guests. Yeah, exactly. So this is South Africa's first coalition government. We learn as we go every day. We have our arguments in cabinet and the subcommittees and so on. Thankfully, those are confidential, so we don't need to tell the press about those. And I think that there are some legal and legislative reforms required to make coalitions more functional, to institutionalize them. I think that while we've got a statement of intent, we need to move to a system of comprehensive coalition agreements. And why do we have these skirmishes and the back and forth is because in Germany, they produce a 300-page document that says, by this date, we will build this bridge in this community, for example. We don't have that level of detail for what it is that we all want to achieve together. So we're finding it as we go along. It's not ideal, but it is the best of a bad set of circumstances.
Everybody talks about the time. I always say, and I've always asked the leaders that you agreed to, you gave them a president before you reached an agreement on what you want. You voted for a president. Like, you got a raw deal that you did not negotiate well enough for yourselves.
Well, if you look at the statement of intent was signed just before the last minute. Yes. Otherwise, maybe a president wouldn't have been elected. And then we have another constitutional crisis, which probably would not have been good for markets, not have been good for employment, not been good for the people of the country. And so, again, I keep saying in politics, it's as opposed to what? And the alternative, sometimes the alternatives are too ghastly. Do you throw, for example, the currency into disarray and cause everyone's petrol price to go up by around R1 a litre for 2 months, even if you can solve it in 2 months? Do you throw the country into that level of disarray? It's one thing to say, okay, we're not unable to pass a budget. Another thing to say, we don't have a president because we couldn't find each other on the day. And so at the end of the day...
You call their bluff, Ashor. I would have done that. I asked, because at the time, there was a conversation about the markets. I had the last sit down with Pravin Gordhan before he passed. It was around that time. And I asked him about the markets and this arguments that there's no other way but the DA because of the markets. And Pravin said to me, the markets never lied to us. We came in on the back of an apartheid government and the markets didn't accept us. So he pretty much rubbished that argument. So I'm like, hey, in those moments, you call that bluff, because what ultimately happened, which is why every day the DA has a red line that it cannot even deal with on its own, is because you gave them a president. And even if you walk away from the GNU tomorrow, government won't collapse. Yeah. You did that to yourselves.
Well, again, as opposed the alternative as opposed to what, and so that's the reality. But also, ultimately, the Constitution gave us such a short space of time, and that's why when I get back to my earlier point, we need serious legal and even constitutional reform, because our electoral system is designed to produce coalitions. We're going to be in coalition government, different kinds of coalitions for the next 100 years. And we have got to now figure out what that looks like. And I firmly believe that we need to amend the constitution. We should have a caretaker government until the government is. We should have a 6-month time limit, maybe. And we should enable that kind of thing so that we can get, so we don't end up with this, down to the wire. Now, were we outplayed? Well, that's your argument. If certainly I'm doing coalition negotiations in 2029, who knows? And the DA is the largest party, will pull the same trick in the ANC.
It'll be interesting to see. I'm worried about time because I know you have to get to the airport, but I want to get a couple of things out of the way very quickly. You are also the DA's campaign manager.
Correct.
I know that Retief Odendaal has been nominated as a mayoral candidate
For Nelson Mandela Bay.
for
Yes.
Nelson Mandela Bay in the Eastern Cape. There's this conversation around Helen Zille in Joburg. What is it? Is she your candidate? Is she not your candidate? What's wrong with Belinda Kaiser or Juzunjuku?
So we've always run an open candidate selection process,
Yes.
as you know, and anyone can put their hat into the ring. And Helen has said she's putting her hat into the ring. That doesn't mean she's selected. We will have a candidate selection committee. In fact, the moment Helen hinted that she's to give her due because she's got to go through a candidate selection process, I took over the management of that process. So Helen doesn't know what questions we're going to ask. She doesn't know what the assignment topic's going to be. Nothing. That's my baby now. And I've taken over that entire process. We will see what comes of that. And the party's got to go through its own internal processes to select. Maybe she's not selected. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that someone isn't. But there are 8 other people. Belinda Ekio-Njoku is a very capable person.
Yeah.
And she was an excellent corporate services MMC in Joburg in the short time that she had, and
She's
so
also
on.
capable in leading. We've been watching her here, which is why people are surprised that they feel she's being overlooked for a Helen. But as you said, she just put a name up.
Yes, she put her name up. She's got to go through the process. Belinda's got to go through the process. Maybe Belinda does a better assignment. Belinda could do, or any number of candidates, and the best candidate will then emerge from that process. But, do we say to people, you can't put your name in? Well, we let any party member. If you remember at a federal congress, we had a Lungile Peñane who stood for every position, including
and nobody knew who
she even stood against me to be the deputy chair of the federal council. And of course, that election was a walk in the park for me, thankfully.
I remember she was an icon walking.
So,
I remember her, yeah.
Open processes are open processes. And I much prefer, for all its idiosyncrasies, the DA's processes where, and yes, it leads to people walking off the job and all sorts of things, but at least we cast the net wide, we pull as many people in, and anyone can put their hand and say, actually, I want to try, and if I'm the successful candidate, then but of course it has had its drawbacks, but I much prefer casting net wide than the sort of parochial approach of you must be in the party for 10 years, you must have done this for 5 years, you must have been in exile for 3 years, or whatever the case might be in other parties. You must have been in the youth league and then the veterans league.
Let's dissect the DA's position for a second.
Sure.
Helen is, if I'm correct, 74 years old.
Yes.
It's an indictment on the DA that in this back and forth about who's capable, the name that seems to draw more interest is somebody who should be a pensioner at home with the grandkids. It says a lot because when you look around and you go, but actually, if not Helen, then who? It draws question marks about the capability, the availability of superstars, if you may, who can serve in municipalities.
Well, we're speaking about one municipality out of 200 and something
Yeah,
across
you've
the country.
appointed Retief Odendaal, so then there's a question mark around Joburg. I've constantly looked around, even with the GNU, mind you.
Yes.
When all of you are being appointed, I looked around and said, so if it's not these people, then who?
So, again,
And
you're
that's
saying
the struggle.
You're saying not the who, but the if you look at the people the DA put into cabinet, and you pointed at Helen's age at 74. All of the youngest cabinet members and deputy ministers are from the DA largely, and we've dragged the average age of cabinet down. This has been studied. Our oldest cabinet member is 57, Dion George. So I'm going to be 58. I'm not going to speak about the oldest members of other parties. So, if we've
You
got
see the Guedas of the
exactly,
world, yeah.
largely, actually, if you look at the DA and you look at who we're putting up as mayors and so on, and the sheer number of young people who are through the ranks in the system, in positions. I mean, Siviwe, as the Minister of Education, Siviwe Kharube is 34. I'm 36 for a little while longer, and so on. So you can have a 74-year-old, you can have a 34-year-old. That's the point of what we call the open opportunity society. is you say Helen should be in pension and retirement. The
Look,
reality
she told me
is
she's going to work until the very end. I take that from her. But I feel like it's an indictment on the party when that's the name that props up.
I fundamentally disagree. I think that what you need to do is, if you've got talented people, you keep your talented people and your capable people. And when you look at Joburg itself, so let's just say if Joburg wasn't in the mess it is, let's ask ourselves this. So, you say it's an indictment, but at the same time, you also said that Belinda's capable. So there we go. So there are capable people. But when you look at the scale of the mess Joburg's in, I'm grateful every day I live in Ekurhuleni because I look across from Ekurhuleni to Joburg and I see no streetlights, and I know that where the light never touches, that's Joburg. So,
No, don't lie. You and I live in Ekurhuleni and I complain about streetlights everywhere.
No, there are lots of streetlights that aren't working.
Yeah, it's a province-wide problem.
But it's not. It's worse. You and I both know that Joburg's worse than Ekurhuleni. Let's be honest.
Can I tell you what my argument is? Because you're
Sure.
going to make an argument about how bad the problem is and why it would need somebody with experience that Helen has. Helen came back into the DA's leadership engine room, in essence, in 2019. And you know what
Yes.
who was in charge in 2019 of the cities here? In Tshwane, it was the Democratic Alliance.
Yes.
On Helen's watch, they took over Joburg. On Helen's watch, they took over Ekurhuleni. So my problem with that argument is, but she was in the engine. Where
Yes.
was the Helen
So
difference? She
let-
was in the engine.
Okay, I can debate this very strongly. So, if you look at the DA's tenure for that short period of time we were in Joburg and Ekurhuleni. So Ekurhuleni, on refuse removal, we did not cover ourselves in glory. There were problems. In the end, the HOD was suspended and so on. But largely, if you look at the financial position of the city and the big structural side of the city, where they only had 7 days of cash on hand, they got up to 30. They were getting up to the MFMA norms. They were paying their ESCOM debt and so on. Those things were heading in the right direction and beginning to work again. Since then, not so
Tshwane,
much.
where you've had successive DA mayors
Yeah.
leaving office again.
Yes, but
You've had so many mayors, and there were also corruption allegations tied to some of those mayors.
so if
Democratic Alliance.
Yes. Okay. So if we go back
Can I just
to
add before you answer? Can I just add this? Because this was a bugbear for me.
Okay.
This was during Celia Brink's tenure. The DA's manifesto launch for the 2024 elections were at the Union buildings. I was like, I'm struggling to understand. It's aspirational, fantastic. But I have to drive through rubbish-strewn Tshwane streets in this DA-run city to get to the
Yes.
Union buildings. And how's the DA proud to own this? They say they're better, but this is it.
Yeah.
Because that's what it was.
yes, you remember at the time during that period there was a big strike of municipal
Wasn't it
workers in
before
Tshwane.
then?
It was around the time of the strike.
Okay.
It was around the time. So the big strike in Tshwane. Otherwise, generally, the Tshwane CBD was much cleaner, but that strike was, and it was quite violent, and the refuse trucks were burnt, and it was a rough time. So that's that around that specific incident. Let me go back to Joburg before I get to Tshwane. So Ekurhuleni, the things were, I think that if you look at once Mpho Palazzi came in 2021 with her make, including Belinda Ekiuzonjoku and Leah Knott and others, during that time we saw genuine service improvements in Joburg. Brief periods when she was there, when the all-star female team was there, Mpho, Leah and Belinda and others, and Michael Suma, I think, was in charge of
Michael's son.
was in police as well, yes, and so
I
on.
remember his
and you
time.
and you
But that was also during the Herman Mashaba era.
Yeah.
That was also a DA
Yes.
era that went sideways.
well, I mean,
Well-
yes. I don't want to get into the politics of Herman Mashaba. That's we need an hour on its own, and we're running out of time.
Yeah.
And my unfortunately, I've got 5 more minutes. We're going to have to.
Oh my
make
God.
notes
Okay,
of
let's
this.
make this fast. Let's make it fast. Yeah.
So that was Joburg, but you saw the service improvements. In Tshwane, obviously, we came in 2019 after the leadership change. We then got to election 2021. And then in election 2021, we elected Randall Williams. And after a year and a bit, our coalition partners basically said to us, and it was an act of blackmail, some of our coalition partners said, if you don't remove Randall, we're going to go with the ANC. So we had to, so in this post-era, we tried to bring stability. We tried to keep the same people. But we make compromises for coalition politics, and so we changed the mayor. Mr. Brink came in. Yes, there was a strike in Tshwane, but we also started seeing some service improvements. We started seeing Hammanskraal Watergrid now is being resolved. You saw all of those things get into motion, and so do we cover ourselves in glory from 2016 onwards in those places? No, but compared to what's happening right now with the extortionist politics that's happening in our cities, I think that we need to get back to that point. And fixing these cities, and I've studied this in a lot of detail now, with the National Treasury reports, our own reports, speaking to the colleagues in the councils and so on. With our cities, before we can get service improvements, we're going to have to get financial stability. They're going to have to start paying their water boards and their power utilities, Eskom and others, for the services that they are receiving and redistributing to residents. And so that base level of that financial stability, where you've got a handful of days of cash on hand and so on, that's going to be an entire year's project on its own. So I think that's what has happened with the coalitions of corruption subsequent, and the one-seat extortionist parties coming in and really extorting the system, is that no, our coalitions fell apart precisely because we could not give the extortionist micro parties what they wanted. And I'm hoping that one part will see what the voters choose. You can't tell the voters what to choose, and I don't ever blame voters for their choices. But based on what the voters decide to do, I'm really hoping that all of the major political parties can behave rationally and understand that much like at national government, we were given no choice. At local government, we might well be given no choice. And that the kind of principles we've enshrined in national government, the largest party leads the coalition and so on, we enshrine at local government and so on, so that we can get these things sorted. And it really is troubling for me. Again, as someone who lives in Gauteng, I don't want to leave Gauteng. I never want to leave Gauteng. I love living in Gauteng. My friends are here. My family's here. That we can't let this place fall apart. And so if, for example, Helen Zille is the best thing that we can get into Joburg, if she's selected, then let's do it, because she understands systems, so does Belinda, so do others. The first year is going to be financial recovery. The second year is going to have to be focused on trading services recovery, which is just electricity, water, refuse removal, and sewage. Those are your trading services. And then we'll be able to do the roads and so on, but it's going to take quite a while.
Internally, though, is that not conflict? People do see you as Helen Zille's golden boy to an extent. I hear it all the time too, from people even outside of your party. So you vetting that process, is that not conflict?
So let me say this, that Helen and I argue at least once a week. So it's not,
sure
not the golden boy,
everyone.
not the golden boy. Let me say this. I have clawed through mud in politics to get, I've never been fast-tracked. I've never been pushed by any. I fought every one of those elections on my own, internally and externally. Helen has never endorsed me or backed me for these things. I mean, she and I have an exceptionally close relationship, precisely because we're both fighters, and because we both stand our ground, and because we fight with each other quite a lot.
I won't be surprised. But that other thing where you deliver to, if she's picked, what you deliver to her Joburg residents is somebody who feels very often like she suffers from colonialism nostalgia.
If you, again, I mean, we're now going all the way back to something in a tweet in 2017. It's now 2025.
She continues in those sentiments in one way or another all the time. It's not a 2017 thing.
A local government election, local government cannot bring back colonialism or apartheid, firstly. And secondly, the DA has been a national government for now in this GNU for a year, almost a year. And apartheid and colonialism is not back. And it won't ever come back because we have a constitutional democracy. The way people analyze history is up to their individual choice and so on. But that's not what a local government election is about. It's about potholes and streetlights and so on. And so much like the Helen Zille of 2006, if she's selected, no guarantee she's selected, by the way. Whoever's selected is going to focus. There's a campaign, and there'll be a campaign message. There'll be a recovery plan for each of these major cities, and the mayoral candidates will have to communicate on that, and will have to put forward an offer on that. We won't be speaking in the election about any analysis in history or harking back to how we interpret history, because that's not.
Want to hear it.
That's not. It's not going to solve. It's not going to solve the problems right now. So my view as the campaign manager is that South Africa's got this problem where politicians keep arguing about a better yesterday, and what's done is done. Whatever's happened in history is history. We can take whichever lens we want. You can take the Marxist lens, as my good friend and colleague Belinda Bizzoli did, and so many colleagues in the ANC do. You can take a straight economic lens like Niall Ferguson. You can do so many things. It's not going to solve the problems of today and tomorrow. And so that's going to be the focus of the campaign.
I can't leave you without talking about Liam Jacobs. You said you fought your way and you went through the ranks. I do get it. Yes. Different spheres of government. Liam, from my understanding, was popular on social media. He's parachuted via DASO, the DA Students Organization, through to Parliament. We see him in the dead of the night, dilly-dong with Gator McKenzie, without resignation letter, but in essence quitting the DA. When you watch that, because that is what I think Professor Samantha Tafikeni said is the DA popcorning young leaders. Your thoughts about all of that?
Lots of people go across to the PA, and then after 6, 12, and 18 months, the longevity seems to be 18 months at most, they come back. They want to come back. And in different parts of the country, take them back, and in different parts of the country, we don't. I think that Liam's made a huge mistake. I think that Liam will come in time when he's older to appreciate that the DA put a lot of faith and trust and development work into him. The Young Leaders Program, and he was on the federal executive and all sorts of things. And we really did try our best. And I do hope that he comes to his senses sooner rather than later. I don't know the circumstance around what drove him. I haven't had a conversation with him, I'm afraid. It's literally fresh off the news, and there are lots of other things that keep me busy, and I think that he'll come to regret it. But I do think that, and as I said earlier, I am a firm believer in casting the net wide. And when you cast the net as wide as we do and try to pull the best of South African society in, you will pick up all sorts of people. Some of them won't be ready yet. Maybe Liam was. I don't know. I haven't worked in detail on this, and I knew Liam peripherally, not very closely, and so on. But these things will happen, and people do come and people go. I mean, in the ANC, Makosi Khoza was a shining star who left, amongst a whole lot of others.
I was going to say, you sound like Gwede Mantashe says, when you open the window, the mosquitoes also.
No.
When you want fresh air, the mosquitoes also come in.
No. But I don't think that they're mosquitoes. I think that they're people who genuinely want to do what's best for their country. But political parties are complicated things, and not just all over the world. In the United Kingdom, half of the Conservative Party is rushing to the Reform Party and so on at the moment.
Yeah.
And the question is, in politics, can you learn, especially in your own political party, can you learn to play well with others, even when you have personality clashes and so on? And too much of politics, for me, and I'm not a personality-driven person, so for me, I'm better at organizational politics because my own personality and my own feelings about things, that stays in the deep recesses of my mind, and I say, what is the outcome? But that's not the case for everyone. And politics does attract people who are driven by personalities, themselves and others. And that's just one of those things you have to navigate. If you're good at navigating it, you can have a very long, very successful career, provided you don't party hop. And there's one other truth about party hopping in South Africa, and that is that voters absolutely hate it. Floor crossing was a deeply unpopular thing when it was legal. And generally voters are very derisive towards the individual politicians who switch between parties, and it's a bit of a joke. It's a running joke. It's
a political tourist now,
exactly.
Like Zanele Mangi. The comment though that was made. This is the last question for me. The comment that was made though is about representation. In that live on Facebook with Gator McKenzie and Ashley Saul, he says, actually they have a point for me to think about. What is the actual picture? Because they said the major block of colored votes go to the DA, but there's no representation. When people are being picked for government, there was clearly no consideration. There's no color representative there. That's what they put it down to.
So, look, let me say this. If Liam says that he left because there's no colored person in amongst the national executive, the ministers and deputy ministers, most of our Western Cape cabinet, where most of our coloured voters come from, are coloured. Our Northern Cape leadership, leader, chair, etc., all coloured. Where he's from, all coloured. Our premier candidate was coloured. Belinda here in Gauteng is coloured. Our former mayor of Randall Williams in Tshwane was coloured, and so on. That argument doesn't hold weight when most of our mayors across the Western Cape are coloured. If I think it was only Giesi van Deventer who retired in Stellenbosch who was white. And so I don't want to do this racial bean counting. It's nonsense. But the point is most of the mayors are coloured and so on. So firstly, his argument doesn't hold water. And then the second question I then have to ask myself is Liam saying he wanted a colored person? If this is what he said, I haven't seen the video. If he said the reason he's left is because there's no color, or is he saying that he should have been the person? I mean, I don't know the motivation there. So all I can say is when I look at it on balance, and you say there's where's the representativity, but if you look at, again, in the Western Cape governments, Deirdre Bartman is younger than me. She's the MEC for Finance in the Western Cape. She happens to be coloured. She's 34. She's got a master's in law. She's extremely capable. And she and I frequently debate economic policy. And she were able to because she's on that level. She happens to be coloured. She happens to be on the same level as me. And we happen to have very good debates. If I think about the MEC for infrastructure and provincially in the Western Cape, Tasha Simmers, same thing. And I can one after the other. I can speak about mayors, the new mayor of Stellenbosch, Mayor Peter Texera in Midvaal.
Oh yes,
yes. I mean, the point is that if you are capable and you are able to do the job, you should be in. And this is the DA's first shot at national government as well. But up and down the country, our most prominent figures, again, here our only mayor in Gauteng happens to be coloured. His argument just begins to fall apart when you start looking at that, because then the representativity is very, very stark and strong.
He's not speaking yet. Hopefully we'll find out more when he does. Ashor, thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
Thank you for your time, guys. That's Ashor Sarupen, and that's it from me.
This is Politricking
On record, Tshidi.
with Tshidi Madia on EWN.